So in this video, I'm going to be talking to you about 5 ways you can finance a $1 million acquisition. So when I say $1 million acquisition, it's a profitable business. It's a profitable $1 million business that you have identified, and instead of creating a business from scratch, you are in the business of buying this and acquiring this business and creating wealth through acquiring multiple businesses rather than creating businesses from scratch, which can be a tedious process of securing licenses, hiring employees, marketing, and all of these things to even see a little ray of light, of cash flow. Versus if you look at a business that's established since last 15-20 years, it's already cash flowing, it has a decent profit margin, and it has typically an older owner because he has gotten old building that business. So if you have a business like that, if you identify it, if the seller wants to sell it, if you've negotiated the price and the terms, how many ways can you finance that deal? Because you don't necessarily have to have the money personally to be able to put up the money for the purchase price. It can be financed just like how you finance a car or a house. And the good thing about buying a business is that, especially a profitable business, is that the profits can be used to pay off for the financing. So it doesn't have to come from your pocket. It's a very self-sustained sort of transaction which does not use your cash flow. It uses the business's cash flow, and you raise funding on the basis of that. So I'm going to talk to you about several structures that are possible for such a type of a deal. So there are typically 5 ways of doing it. Number 1 is probably the worst, but I'm going to talk about it, is known as equity financing. Equity financing means you bring in money and you give out shares or ownership in a company. It could be your company, it could be the company that you're buying, whichever level it is. When you receive money and you give out shares, that's known as equity. And when someone puts equity, they're typically putting their own money, unless it's a private equity firm or a venture capital firm. Typically, they're putting their personal funds that they accumulated over a period of time, and they have a lot of personal attachment to it. And equity capital tends to be very expensive. What do I mean by expenses? How is money expensive? Well, whether a financing is expensive or not depends on how much money you have to pay back. And typically equity financing, they're looking at 30% return on their money, and it's pretty high to deliver that, and they could be looking for even more than that. So that's equity financing. When someone gives you money, they will take ownership. And if you find a business you want to buy and an investor puts all the money in, and assuming you are giving ownership in that particular business that you're buying, they will almost always take most of the shares in the company. They would have a controlling stake, and they would probably give you a few percentage just to find and negotiate the deal. And that's a horrible structure, and it's not recommended that you do it. So that's one way you can finance the deal. If you look at Shark Tank, typically those deals are equity financing, where they give money and get ownership. And when the business starts working out, they will give a little more and get a little more ownership. And before you know it, the owner of the business gets diluted down and eventually pushed out. So basically, he worked to build that business. The owner used their money, yes, but now the business is built and mistakes have been made and corrected, and the business is now valuable, and this is the time where they write a check to the founder and throw him out of the company. And that's not a very rare scenario, shall we say. In fact, I was looking to raise some equity for my company, and I asked my finance director at that time that what should we do? What does a private equity firm want? Should we go to private equity for the funding? And he said, do you know what a private equity firm wants, Prithvi? I said, what? He says, this little baby that you have called Vital Gates, your company, I said, yes. He says, they want to take this away from you, Prithvi. They want to take this beautiful baby that you have called Vital Gates away from you. That's what a private equity wants. And I was just asking what terms and all of that, and he said, fundamentally, that's what they want. You know, they want you to work and work and work and build the company, and then eventually they'll take you over. And once some value is created, they will capture it. So that's why equity financing can be a little bit, dangerous for your ownership. So that's one structure. The other one is debt, where you borrow the money and you pay interest. So here there are several forms of debt involved, and you can make use of this. One of them is called commercial debt, which can be taken from a bank, and you could use it to buy the company. I'm not going to talk too much detail, that's a subject of another video, but one of the forms is you raise money from a bank. And you could raise it from a bank, that's called commercial loan, and you could also raise it from a private investor. So there are several individuals who are high net worth individuals who have a bunch of cash sitting in their bank account, and they can give you a loan on a high interest and a low collateral type of financing, where you're paying them like an interest which is high, but you're getting financing with very little collateral. And this is like private financial companies. There are many family offices that do this. There are private finance companies that do it. I have seen a few examples of that when I was trying to look for money. There was one wealthy individual I had a meeting with. He did this. He gave private lending. And there was another gentleman that I was about to be introduced to. He had $1 billion or something sitting, and he wanted to start lending. I cannot verify whether he really had that money or not, but I was told that he's a wealthy man and he's looking to give some private lending. So private lending and commercial lending would be debt, that would be debt. Or the third option could be a mixture of debt and equity. So a portion of the deal you finance as a loan, and a portion an investor injects. Now this is also a structure that I have seen where people do a combination of these. In fact, a lot of the deals are concluded with this structure, debt plus equity. Now this is something that private equity firms also do. So, there are funds established to carry out an investment activity where they buy many businesses. They raise a bunch of money from investor, and they structure a fund around it, and then there's a fund manager, and you know how private equity firms are structured. Even when they go buy a company, they're not using all of that money to do a deal. They are also putting as little of that money that they raised as possible, and raising rest of it as debt, because debt is cheap, and when you raise debt, you get to keep the ownership. So maximum portion tends to be in the favor of debt. Now, why would you raise debt to buy a company? Is because you would only do it if it's a profitable company that you're buying. You would not want to do it if it's a loss-making business, unless you are a genius. You can turn any operation around. Apart from that, you typically are acquiring profitable businesses at a low price. So in that scenario, debt tends to be the type of favorite financing of people. Number 4 is called mezzanine financing, which is a little bit complex for me to explain because I'm not a technical financial expert that has done a couple of years of degree in finance or anything. But mezzanine is a mixture of debt and equity where there is a convertible debt. So instead of interest, or if you cannot make the payment, they will take over the shares, or they will take over the share first, and as you repay the loan, you are clawing back into your ownership. So it's a structure very similar to that. You can Google it. It's called mezzanine financing. Some people do a combination of debt and mezzanine also. So that's another structure that's available. And number 5 is the hot favorite, seller's finance, where the seller gives you a loan to buy his company. And yes, you heard me right, it's not exactly a loan because he's not giving you money, but he's giving you what you want to buy upfront, and you make the payments over time. So an example would be somebody has a car and it's a vintage car, and that person is not able to sell that car, and you love that car, you want that car, and he happens to be your friend. You walk up to him and there is already a trust established, and you say that, listen, I will take your car, you're not able to sell this, and whatever the price that you're asking for it, I will pay you a little bit high price. And the seller is like, oh wow, that's great, you're offering me a higher price. And in exchange, what I want for the higher price is that I will not be able to make all the payment up front. I would take control of the car, I would drive it, and then I would pay you on a monthly installment over time. And that would be an example of seller's finance. And then what I do is I take the car, I give it to Uber vintage car, right? So I give it to Uber and I put a driver in it, and it generates cash flow, and that cash flow pays for the payment. There's no money out of my pocket. That would be an example of seller finance. In a scenario of car, it's a little bit, complicated and not practical, but it happens in business because the business is producing money. So you're not buying something that goes down in value, you're buying something that goes up in value, and it has cash flow. So that cash flow can be used to make the payment to the seller. And sometimes they have a down payment where the seller say, oh no, give me 10% at least upfront or 20% upfront, and the 80% you can pay me over time. And then you can negotiate it down. You can say, okay, I can give you a much higher price, but I want 100% seller's finance where there's no money in the transaction involved. You take over the business and you make the payments. This typically happens in very small businesses. Why? Because big companies don't tend to buy small businesses, and people are generally not into buying other businesses. People are generally into buying real estate or investing in public companies. But you don't hear often about people who have a bunch of cash sitting who want to go into the local market and start buying up businesses. That happens very rarely, and it's typically a person who's already in that business that buys another business. But a layman, doesn't usually go and buys a business. They buy real estate. People feel comfortable with real estate, but they don't feel comfortable if they are not a doctor to buy a healthcare practice. So if there is a healthcare practice, it's making good money, there is a chance that that business will never be acquired by anyone, because not everybody is a doctor and not everybody understands how to run a business. I'm not saying you have to be a doctor, but a lot of the people believe that to run a clinic or to own a clinic, you have to be a doctor. That's a common belief actually among a lot of people. And you might be surprised when you tell someone that you don't have to be a doctor to own a clinic. They'd be like, how is that possible? And it is possible. You need to be a doctor to practice medicine and to consult on medicine, but not necessarily to have ownership in the business. And that's what you want to do. You want to take ownership in the business, not consult patients. So a lot of the people don't do this. There are only big companies, private equity firms, venture capital firms that have operational team, that have funds, that can afford to acquire other companies, and they have available financing. So, and these types of companies tend to focus on big groups and big acquisitions. So these small mom and pop shops, like, small companies typically do not have the opportunity to get acquired. And if you look at in your own city or region, you can find thousands and thousands and thousands of these businesses, and you can have an understanding that they may not be able to exit. And you can also look at all the big companies who are acquiring other companies and what were the size of those deals. And you will find that typically big companies are acquiring 50 million, 15 million, $100 million companies, but nobody is touching the $500,000 to $1 million company, small companies. So now you can go and you can make an offer and you can negotiate a deal And if the owner is desperate enough and motivated enough, they accept it. And to do this, you have to kiss a lot of frogs. So that's the fifth way to finance an acquisition, $1 million acquisition. So that is the video, 5 ways to finance $1 million acquisition with not your money. And if you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button, and I will talk to you soon.